everyone, this is episode number 210 of the Bar Above podcast, and we are continuing our focus on dry January, and we are going to be talking about a subject that might be a little bit taboo, a little bit sensitive in the industry and in craft cocktails, and that is around the topic of addiction. With all the people that we've lost in the industry over the years, whether it be through alcohol or drug addiction or whatever addiction it is, I think it's an important conversation we should have as an industry and not be something that we shy away from. So today we're going to have kind of a candid conversation about addiction with Dr. Judy Grisel, and I'm really excited about this. I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope you do as well. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bar Above podcast. Today we have a special guest I'm super excited for, Professor Judith Grisel, who is not only a professor, but also a recovering alcoholic, and probably my favorite title I've ever had to introduce, a psychopharmacologist, as well as an author and public speaker. Judith, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be with you.
So I'm going to go ahead and just set the groundwork here, and for all the listeners, I have a feeling this is probably going to be one of the hardest conversations I've ever had to have on this podcast, but I am very, very much excited about it. This is all about addiction. So I think this is a great conversation to have. And I think we have an amazing guest, probably one of the foremost authorities in the area. So once again, thank you very much for joining me. And I have so many questions for you.
Good. Let's get started.
Okay, so before we get kind of too deep into the science, because I know that's kind of where you really specialize in, I'd love to hear your backstory on how you got interested in this particular topic of addiction.
Well, one way to put it, Chris, is that I've done about, 40 years of research, but the first 10 were on the streets and the last 30 mostly in the basement of biology buildings and doing research. Mm-hmm. So I took my first good drink. It was about a half a gallon of wine when I was just about 13, and it changed the trajectory of my entire life. I absolutely loved it. Mm-hmm. I was thrilled, I guess, to find what felt like the solution to boredom and anxiety and loneliness kind of all in one bottle. And so I was an avid drinker from then on. Even though I was so young, I ended up getting kicked out of 3 schools, the first one in 10th grade for spiking the punch. And it was a Catholic girls' school, so they didn't like that stuff. I think people don't get kicked out for that kind of thing anymore. But anyhow, so I loved drinking, and I loved what it did for me, so much so that I didn't do much else. And I ended up using a lot of other drugs. What actually brought me to the bottom was cocaine, probably. This was in the 80s. So alcohol was like an old friend, but cocaine was the evil partner, I guess. Anyhow, I ended up in treatment, didn't know what it was at that time, and couldn't believe that alcohol and other drugs were the cause of my wrecked or disastrous life. But I kind of listened, because without being wasted, I realized a little bit that things weren't going great. And anyhow, I thought that I would cure addiction. I was just 23, but I thought, if I have a disease and I'm not going to be able to live and use, I'm just going to cure my disease so I can live and use. And that's what took me down the road of neuroscience. I was convinced that there was something different about my brain, and I still am convinced. It's different about my brain and others like me that cause this sort of obsessive compulsive use all the way, to the grave. So I have now been clean and sober for a long time, and I've learned a lot. I don't know exactly what's wrong with my brain, but I have a lot of ideas, and I'm happy to talk with you about them.
Excellent. And then, so the big question that I have is, you've kind of lived both sides of this kind of pyramid, I would assume. of addiction and then studying research in addiction, has your kind of that previous 10 years of being an addict really helped to fuel your research and give you a different perspective than other people might have when kind of going down this research avenue?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so.
Hmm.
One of the things about scientists, which is both their strength again and their weakness, but they tend to get really caught up in little details. And sometimes, for instance, I'll be at a meeting or reading a scientific paper and I'll just laugh out loud because it's really stupid, and so not relevant, I think, to experience. On the other hand, I would also say that many recreational users have no idea about the neurobiology and the scientific findings. So I do think in general that the conversations like we're having today are
Hmm.
wonderful and important for both sides, and that communication and sort of understanding the what it feels like and what the challenges and opportunities are for people who are trying to balance their own use, and also what the challenges and opportunities are for scientists who are trying to help, reduce the burden of addictions.
Perfect. And then, so one of the questions, as I was preparing for this interview, what I was thinking, like, how do addictions start? Like, what is that initial kind of cling that makes your brain say, "Yeah, I want more of this," or
Mhm.
"No, that's not really that interesting." Like the scenario that I came up with in my head, which is absolutely ridiculous, is like, why doesn't your brain say, the only thing I want more than anything else in this world is broccoli"? Like,
Mm.
no one's brain's ever going to say that. But why alcohol, or why some of these other harder drugs? What happens to kind of get
Yeah,
that
why
ball
is
rolling?
everything good bad and everything bad good, huh?
Right.
I think, well, so all addictive drugs are addictive
Hmm.
because they activate a core neural circuit in our brains that releases dopamine in an area of the limbic system. And the limbic system has a lot to do with emotion and motivation. So they release dopamine in this nucleus accumbens, which is part of the limbic system. And that is really sort of the neural definition of compelling. So it's compelling in a kind of delicious, little bit naughty, um, fun way,
Hmm.
as alcohol and other drugs are. And broccoli, unfortunately, is not, because it doesn't release dopamine there. So these drugs activate this pathway, which of course didn't evolve for our drug use. It
Hmm.
evolved to help us enjoy things that would promote our survival and the survival of our species, which are essentially sex and food. So these pathways are activated by foreplay and chocolate cake, as well as cocaine and a nice drink and all that stuff. However, I think really what's underneath your question is something that really drives my research and a lot of people's research, which is that we all have this pathway, but some people aren't going to self-destruct activating it, and others really do suffer. So what's really different? We all have the pathway. And a couple of things. I would say that some of us are born with a sort of hunger in that pathway
Hmm.
that is especially sensitive to addictive drugs. And sometimes it's specific drugs. So some of us really appreciate the effects of alcohol more than others. My husband's a social drinker and he doesn't understand why, so much you would want to overdo it. Sometimes he overdoes it a little, but it's not something he strives for. Whereas for me, I would drink until I couldn't drink anymore because I was passed out.
Hmm.
So for some people, I think it's more inclined to excess. And one of the factors in that are genetic differences. Another big factor is how early you start. So it turns out that if you get loaded before you're 18, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of being someone like me.
Oh,
But if
wow.
you wait until you're, let's say 21, just a couple more years, you have about a 1 in 25 chance. So much reduced risk. And that's because the brain is so malleable and so sensitive to meaningful opportunities like drugs sort of mimic or pretend to be, I guess, in a way,
Mhm.
that it's much more risky if you start early. And then one more thing, I guess I would say. So genetics, early use, and then adverse childhood experiences. So it turns out that people who have a pretty good life enjoy the kind of extra benefits of a little bit of substances here and there. But people who've had a lot of trauma, especially early trauma, tend to find those drugs act more like medicine than like, icing on the cake. So those three things I would say are the biggest factors.
Now, in your research, is there kind of an area, like an age group, where the effects of addiction are kind of at their lowest, like the ability for a chemical or a substance to addict somebody is kind of at the lowest threshold? You mentioned
Yeah.
21 is kind of like 1 in 25 chance. Does that just increase as you get older?
Probably. That's a
Mhm.
great question. So it turns out that addiction is a form of learning, and you're much better at learning everything when you're a kid. And the
Mhm.
older you get, you can still learn. You can teach a 80-year-old something, but it takes a lot longer. And so because addiction is learning, it would take a lot longer for an 80-year-old's brain to adapt because it's really brain adaptation that leads to addiction. But kids learn, like this almost overnight. So
Mhm.
that fact is good for many things, for picking up languages or a new career, but also developing addictions. So I would say that the most vulnerable time is before 25. And after 25, the brain is considered mature, which means in a way it's harder to learn brand new things. There's some tricks that older people have that younger people don't, but the kind of natural, facile ability to pick up new things is underlaid by the fact that the brain is being organized. And so it's almost like you're trying to build roads.
Mhm.
And before any roads have been laid down, your experiences sort of determine where those are going to go and how some are going to be stronger than others. Once they're laid down, which is at about 25, you can still, build a cul-de-sac here and there, but it's not so easy to do.
Got it. So the highways won't get laid down necessarily.
Right.
It'll be a little bit more of
Right.
like the smaller avenues. And yeah,
Yeah.
okay, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Um,
And binge
Perfect.
drinking, for instance, in
Uh,
adolescence, which is a really common way of using, is something that lays down different highways.
got it. And then can you describe what like the example of binge drinking is? Because I think I have a general understanding, and I think most people do, but like what does binge drinking actually kind of mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, your general understanding is probably right. It means
Mhm.
drinking to get drunk, which takes in men about 4 drinks, no, 5 drinks in 2 hours, and in women about 4 drinks within 2 hours. I was saying to my 19-year-old daughter, if you drink 1 drink across a whole hour on a full stomach, that's kind of the opposite of binge drinking because it'll probably never even get to your brain. But if you're getting enough alcohol to your brain to reach the legal limit, let's say zero point zero 0.08 milligrams per deciliter alcohol, then you are drunk legally, and you have gotten that way through binge drinking, I guess. So, it's about, for the average man, 4 drinks in 2 hours.
Got it. Okay, perfect. And then when we talk about addiction, is it a kind of a binary thing? Is it like I am addicted, I am not addicted, or is it more kind of a spectrum of addiction?
Your questions are fantastic
Thank
because,
you.
yeah, I can't answer that. There's a big debate.
Mhm.
Um, And it's so important for a couple reasons. One is, if it was binary, in theory, we'd be able to say, yes, you, no, you, yes, you, no, you. And then people would be able to sort much better, as well as their insurance companies or their employers or their, future dates. We could, predict this. It doesn't seem to be that easy. The other big implication is, if it's yes or no, maybe you could turn it off. I think there are people who believe it's graded, and so that you can kind of go back and forth. My personal read of the literature is that if you start before you're 25, let's say, and stop before you're 25, you might be able to back out, and then be a kind of a social user. So if you don't, your brain is plastic, so it could learn addiction, but it could also learn sort of moderate, healthy behavior. But if you start before you're 25 and stop by 35, I think that's harder. But if you start at 30, and this has happened with a lot of people during the pandemic, you start late and all of a sudden you notice, geez, I'm kind of overdoing it. My dad was doing this. He's in his 80s, and he was saying, I noticed I liked a glass of wine with lunch, and then I thought, well, two would be good. He's 80, and he realized that he was not enjoying his meal so much if he didn't have the two glasses, so he backed out. So we don't understand. We can't diagnose addictions in the same way we could diagnose cancer or diabetes. We don't have a blood test or some kind of other way. So it's a little squiffy around the edges, but, and there's not a lot of evidence that people who are really out of control can regain control. However, there is some. So this is, just to be fair, I would say it's an open question. In my own life, I figure it's not a hypothesis I want to test, because the only way I could prove that I could normally drink is to not self-destruct. And that seems like proving, that I can fly by jumping off the roof and, hoping it works out. So probably not the best. There's not a ton of evidence, I would say.
Got it. Okay. That makes a ton of sense.
But, Chris, just to go back, I think what you're getting at is that what we call problem drinkers, let's say, are a heterogeneous group. And there's lots of ways to be a problem drinker. And probably for some of those, it's not likely that they could become an unproblem drinker. But for others, possibly it is. And I think that's probably the case. So.
Got it. And I imagine there's a lot of self-control that's kind of part of this equation too, right? Like if somebody, I'll use myself as an example, because I'll probably be doing that a lot throughout this episode. But for me, I always had a healthy respect for alcohol. I think this is something you and I talked about before we started videoing, and I've been in a couple of atmospheres where I'm surrounded by addictive personalities. I was a crap dealer in Vegas, so I saw how that plays out, and not exactly excited about that. And then I became a bartender, once again, surrounding myself with the potential to be around highly addictive personalities. And so I decided that, I have a healthy relationship and fear of going down this road. But when we talk about like alcohol and consumption, one of the things I've always wondered is, that boundary between social drinking and binge drinking. It seems like the kind of the tipping point is the purpose for which you're doing it, right? So social drinking is to hang out with friends, to enjoy it with a meal, for the experience, for flavor, versus binge drinking is the focus of me starting to drink is to get drunk. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yeah, although it's hard for me to, so I think that's a good guess. And I think I guess I just wonder how many people use alcohol as a tool. They have a tough week or a death in the family, and they just realize, gee, I could kind of take the edge off of this.
Right.
And so they are getting a little wasted, but they don't make a habit of it.
Right.
So I guess it might not be even that clear.
Sure, sure.
Ideally, we're just drinking it, I guess, for the taste. But and then there's people like me who only drank it for the effect. I
Right,
didn't
right.
care if it was tastes like turpentine, but I do think that there's a kind of a gray area in there for many people.
Right, absolutely. Now that you say that, I'm like, oh yeah, there's been many occasions where I felt frustrated or whatever, and I wanted a cocktail just to kind of take that edge off.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So um, one of the other things I was wondering is, you know, when we talk about alcohol addiction, um, from a personal perspective, as in, I am the person consuming the alcohol. I feel like I have a healthy relationship with alcohol. But are there any signs I should be looking out for of like, maybe you don't. Maybe there's some things in, maybe it's having a little bit stronger hold on you than, one realizes. I was hoping that maybe you could offer up some ideas of, if people start seeing patterns develop in themselves, could this be a signal for possible addiction?
Mhm. So I think we're kind of talking around this a little
Mhm.
bit, but it starts out usually for fun or experimentation to relax a little bit, and it just pretty obvious. But this is using drugs to change our feelings and our psychological states is as old as humanity. So this
Right.
is a basic drive to do this. So that's good and or fine and normal. And then I think it could become a habit.
Hmm.
And if it becomes a habit, it could become a compulsion. And so the one thing that two things I guess I would really watch out for. One is that you decide not to drink because you're on antibiotics or you have a big day or something. And, but you break that. So I think then it's a sign that maybe your intention is being kind of overridden by this probably a brain state that is just like any other habit, like smoking or even like turning right at this part in the, you just kind of we follow our habits.
Hmm.
And then it could be a tool so that let's say you have a pretty regular habit and then you do have a really crappy day or a pandemic and then you think, well, geez, my habit's going to kind of come in handy. And
Hmm.
what generally happens as a sign is that there's tolerance and dependence. So like my dad, small glass of wine used to do it, but now he wants two
Hmm.
or three. This is not him because once he's needed two, he backed off. But um, or you're dependent in that lunch isn't quite as good without it, and the evening's not quite as good without it. So this is a common dilemma for people like me or trying to get sober, in that, geez, everything I do that's fun involves alcohol. So now I don't know if I can, I'm dependent on alcohol to have fun. And often with this drug, since it's a sedative and it helps
Hmm.
us sleep, people will not sleep as well. So if you're drinking regularly and not sleeping well, even if you're not drinking a ton, it could become a compulsion. And then because the brain, choice is always good, but
Hmm.
whatever we do often and regularly, we kind of offload from the choice making parts of our brain because that part's busy trying to think of other complicated things. So it just offloads that to habits, which is useful in many cases, but maybe not so much when it comes to addictive substances.
Got it. Okay. Um, and then I'm gonna ask you one more question here. Sorry,
Oh,
I
it's
had to go off
fun.
screen there for a second. Um, so one of the other questions I want to ask you, and this is something I've wanted to ask for many, many years, and it's going to be kind of a more of a kind of a theoretical role playing scenario of kind of the lifestyle of a bartender. So I'm going to kind of describe kind of a typical one of my typical shifts, not quite typical for me. Probably a little bit exaggerated if I'm being honest here. But to give your perspective on kind of what's happening either with the body or kind of like laying some pathways down for potential addiction. And then I'm going to throw a couple more variables into the mix and just get a general sense of like, how is this affecting my health? What happens if this happens long term, if that makes sense?
Sure.
Okay. Let's say brand new bartender going into the bar. First thing you do is you have 1 or 2 cups of coffee. That starts your day. And it's probably about 4 o'clock in the afternoon here, 3 o'clock. You're setting up your bar. You've had 2 cups of coffee. You're feeling pretty good. You're amped up. You've got, caffeine going through your system. You're getting ready for your shift. So you have a beer or you have a shot or something. And now it's time to greet customers. Now you're excited. And then about halfway through the shift, let's say like 5, you have lunch or something to eat. And then halfway through the shift, maybe you have another beer or a shot, and it's high energy, like really stressful. You have the adrenaline kind of surging through you at this point. Right around 10, everything starts to slow down. You have 1 more drink. So let's say you're about 2 drinks in now, maybe 3, and you just kind of relax and you're starting to kind of go down that adrenaline, the backside of the adrenaline kind of mountain, as I describe it. And now you're just kind of cleaning up your station. You're getting ready to go out and then, off your shift. And then you are done with your shift around 11. And then you go out to a bar with your friends from work and you have a shot and a beer right away. Okay, that's 11 o'clock. You order a meal, typically pretty heavy, pretty greasy, fatty, burgers, hot dogs kind of thing. And you have a couple more drinks throughout the course of that afternoon. So that's kind of like the starting point. How has that, if this is a long-term habit, let's say over 5 or 10 years, what are some of the kind of health ramifications of that? And what are some kind of things to watch out for?
Well, I am so sympathetic to this because it was my life too. I was a bartender. First
okay. I didn't know that.
Then a bartender. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A few places. And I would say a few things, but the first one we're really understanding now more than ever, and this is just in maybe the last 5 years, is that the circadian rhythm, the 24-hour light dark cycle that we all evolved as a function of, is really setting our biology. It's setting our thoughts, the way we think, and our speed of thinking, and also our mood, our energy level, and our physiology. So that for most people, right around daylight, they wake up, they're aroused, they stay that way. There's a little lull in the afternoon and then a second wind. As it gets dark, they get sleepy and go to bed. And this is, a function of eons of evolutionary pressure. There wasn't even electricity till a few hundred years ago.
Right.
So this was how we all evolved. Well, we don't have to be tied to the sun and the moon anymore so much. We can turn on the lights, we can get up when we want, we can set the alarms. And many of us are working, at off hours, not right in the middle of the day. But that is tough on our biology and our cognition. So like you say, you're going to work at 3 or 4, that's in the little afternoon dip. And so what's the solution? Espresso. And then also, after work, just like after a workout or after anything else stimulating, it's not really, you can't really go straight to sleep. You're meant to sort of unwind. Well, it's handy if you work in a bar to unwind with some booze. And then, of course, you're hungry because you've been eating when everyone else was eating. In fact, one of the things that was hard about it for me was that everybody else would be unwinding with the drinks I was making and the food I was serving, but I would be, have to be up. So that's unnatural. And it is tough on us. And it's also tough because it's a little lonely. People are out enjoying their time, relaxed. And I'm in a stressful job sometimes and trying to keep a smile on my face while my kid is sick or whatever else is going on. So, I'm kind of out of sync with the social, cultural flow. a
Yeah.
little bit, and that's lonely. And I think that can also drive um, drinking. And then, as you said, the solution is to go hang out with the people that we work with who are all in the same boat and often um, struggle with how do I relax in a healthy way at the end of the night. And I guess it would be another, an alternative might be to get off work, have a nice big salad and take a 3-mile walk and, you know, go home and read a book. But that's harder to do at the end of the day. And that's another point. I think we start out with a lot of cognitive reserve, which is sort of our mental ability to make the right choices and delay gratification. So that's high when we first wake up. But at the end of the day, when the bartenders are working, that's naturally low in all of us. We're just kind of at our weakest. This is when I pull out the ice cream. And so if we're at the weakest, then it's easy to say, oh, one more drink isn't going to hurt, or, another hour. And then not having a great sleep because that many drinks, as you described, sounds like 6 or 7 in a few hours is enough to disrupt sleep. So then you wake up, feel crappy. How do you fix that? Well, another drug. So I think it leads to a cycle that's hard, hard on our bodies and hard on our minds and spirits. And maybe there needs to be some more clubs of alternative things to do, a running club, get off work and go for a run. That would take a lot of fortitude, but probably somebody can do it.
Yeah, and I think I don't think I've heard anybody kind of encapsulate the experience of hospitality better than what you just described. From not only from the consumption perspective, but also kind of the emotional perspective too, because I think that's often part of the equation that we don't talk about within hospitality is that kind of the mismatch socially of the people we're serving versus who we are and our rhythm and stuff. So I've never heard that perspective before, and it's been really, really enlightening to hear that. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm still kind of processing that, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I remember one time going up to a table. This was a kind of a fancy restaurant before I started working at the taverns, but and saying something like, hi, how are you? I think it might have been, it wasn't New Year's, but it was some kind of Thanksgiving or something. I'll have a gin and tonic or something, and I realized, wow, I am just the person to deliver the stuff here. Nobody's really interested in having a conversation. And I think that's unnatural too. Anyway, maybe I'm beating a dead horse, but
no, I think a lot of people maybe listening are like, oh yeah, no, I can feel all those things. So I wanted to kind of throw a couple of variables into this mix now that we've kind of laid that baseline down of, the circadian rhythm. I think was a huge component that I never even thought about, with the espresso being kind of that jolt to kind of like simulate that wake up, mental state. So we have the espresso, we have coffee in the beginning, alcohol throughout, and then a heavy meal with alcohol in the end. So let's say instead of the espresso, or in addition to the espresso, one of the other things that we could draw from, and this is very common in the bartending world, it's not something I ever dabbled in, but let's say instead of coffee, or in addition, you use cocaine, or you use another stimulant in there. Like, how does that start to really affect, other things down the road?
yeah, so it's a great question. Again, what these substances do, caffeine, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, is they're kind of stepping on pedals to manipulate our internal states in just the right way, and we have so many available substances to do this now. You can sort of become your own pharmacologist, take a little of this and a little of this. The stronger the stepping on the pedal, and cocaine is much stronger, or amphetamine, than caffeine. It's just better at it, right? It'll really wake you up. So the stronger the pedal is pushed, the more risky it is, because we're again going from our healthy natural state that we're it's not like we just popped out of a vacuum. We've come from this long history designed to help us flourish. So what would be flourishing is probably, nuts and berries. And people drank, but in a group and a little bit, and, an occasion, often ritually kind of based. So, but if you're using harder drugs, then the up and down is so much more harsh and powerful, that the brain's way of adapting is going to be also strong and powerful. So if we're having, little bits of changes, the brain will adapt to that. But it's almost like rocking a boat so much that the brain's adaptation is to cause pathology, anxiety, depression, addiction, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, excellent. And then so that kind of answers the flip side of that coin of like, okay, now we take, we smoke marijuana or weed at the end of the shift to kind of calm down and kind of get us back to that steady state. Now we're just kind of like rocking that boat even harder,
Yeah.
right? So that's going to have a lot more impact emotionally, physically, and probably long-term health as well, right? If I had to guess.
Yeah. So, Chris, I think that the rule of thumb, which is so unfortunate, it's the bane of every person with a problem, it's that there's no free lunch. So the higher you go up, the lower you come down. And this
Right.
is, Newton too. I think this is like the second law of thermodynamics or something, but energy isn't created or destroyed. It just kind of goes in opposite directions. So
Right.
when, as close as you can, when you take a substance to change your brain, to change your experience, your brain produces the opposite effect. This is why taking a sedative before bedtime makes you not sleep as well.
Interesting.
Taking caffeine. So I'm completely addicted to caffeine, which just means I'm tired without it.
Oh, that's
Because
so
my
crazy.
brain is adapted. So the brain produces the exact opposite effect.
Wow.
This is why people who drink too much often are anxious and need to drink. People who take cocaine can't, or amphetamines can't focus and be alert without them. So anyway, I think that it's unfortunate, but the more you use, the bigger the rebound. And the more regularly used, the bigger the rebound. And the younger you start using, the bigger the rebound. But the brain is capable of adapting until the day we die. So there's always a risk.
Perfect. Well, this kind of goes on to the next segue. And first of all, I want to say thank you, because this has been in my head for a couple of years and I just didn't know who to ask. So when you said you would join us on a podcast, I'm like, oh, I'm going to see if she can answer this question. And it has been really, really fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing that. And then kind of on the flip side of that, we're talking about, what's next when we talk about addiction and we talk about getting to that point of like people realize they have a problem and they want to stop. They know they need to stop for health reasons. I mean, that cycle that we just talked about, I mean, let's take judgment aside. Anything else. It's not healthy, right? I think that's something we can all agree on. What is the best advice for getting help and going through that kind of cleansing process of kind of moving out of addiction?
Well, that's a $20 million question too. It's but
Sorry.
it's close to my heart. It
Yeah.
really. So first, I would say, and this is obvious, I guess, but nothing likes a vacuum. And so if my way of coping with boredom or stress or loneliness or just, passing the time involves getting loaded, I can't just take that away and now, be kind of a better citizen. I think that's naive. But it is important to know that because drugs are addictive, because they're so good at satisfying these needs. So the things that you would replace it with, which have to be something and they have to be compelling, they can't be, something you don't love,
Can't be broccoli.
are hard to find at first. So I would say, this is also from the neurobiology, it should be something active. The way that alcohol and every other addictive drug works in the brain is to turn on sort of motivational systems. So something that you care about. And that often the easiest thing for that is relationships. And just with friends, with, take a new class, join a hiking, instead of going out to the bar, go to this would be hard for me, but the Peloton or something, and you have maybe a relationship with the people in your group or something.
Mhm.
So that, or a hobby, so doing something. It's, I think, not a good idea to say, look, I'm just not going to go. I'm going to just stay home and sit on my hands. That's almost destined to fail, maybe.
Right.
So friends, hobbies, it's really helpful if your friends are in the same boat. So there are groups of people all over the world, maybe the universe, who are trying also not to self-destruct with alcohol and other drugs. And they are not a glum lot. So they have lots of fun things to say. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And then I have this thing about it, which is that I really treat myself well. I
Mhm.
have a quick story, but I got my PhD finally after years of study. I was going to solve addiction, and I hadn't solved it. And I came out of the room where I was being grilled for hours and hours, and my fellow grad students were standing around, and they all kind of looked sort of sick. And I said, "Hey, Frank, what's up with your sad face?" And he said, "We always celebrate with champagne. That's how we do it. And we don't know what to do. Like, do we pat you on the back or what?" And I was clean about 6 or 7 years at this point. And my first thought was, damn right, I deserve some champagne.
Mhm.
Look how hard I worked. This is so unfair. And I got to say, they had crappy champagne in plastic cups. It wasn't like it was a good thing, but I still felt totally deprived. So I thought
Right.
about it with some friends. You know what I did? I ended up buying myself a plane ticket to New Zealand, and I went backpacking for 7 weeks by myself.
That's
I mean, I
awesome.
met a lot of cool people there, but so I didn't just say, no, you don't get champagne, too bad for you. I thought, how would I really want to celebrate?
Right.
And so, uh, you know, I go to lots of live music. I love that. Um, I don't deprive myself
Mhm.
of, but you know, so I find other things, and whatever those are, I think if they matter to you, then they will be good substitutes. And it's not so easy at the beginning. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that I'm taking away from it is meaningful celebrations, right? Because you could have had that glass of champagne, but we wouldn't have had this conversation. You wouldn't have, that would not have been a story that you retold. You would have just been like, yeah, I got my PhD and we had a glass of champagne, versus all the experiences that you got to have on that celebratory trip that you took. That's super cool. Of, a different way of thinking about celebrating is creating an experience that is memorable versus something that you're probably never going to remember, that specific instance again.
Not to mention that if I'd had the champagne, I would have probably gone out and got a bottle of scotch. And then I
Right.
probably wouldn't be here having this conversation
The
either.
conversations would have been very different. Yeah.
Mhm.
So the last question I have, and then we'll wrap this one up, is what does psychopharmacologists do? Like, how does that work?
So it turns out science is a good substitute for drugs because it is meaningful,
Uh-huh.
because it's all about discovery. It's kind of like being a pirate or something where you're looking for the treasure, and data is really meaningful to me. So I am trying to understand what's different about the brains of people like me before they ever start. So I study the effects of drugs on psychological functioning, which is
Mhm.
psychopharmacology. And psychological functioning is our thoughts and feelings and our behavior. So I'm interested in drugs that affect that. I'm not so interested in drugs that affect the heart or blood pressure or, toenail growth. I'm really interested in what's going on in the brain. And of course, there's so many plants and animals that have evolved things, chemicals
Mhm.
that affect our brains. And then we have laboratories where we can synthesize these things. So I just find the whole project really fascinating. And and satisfying to do something that's everyday, novel, and interesting. And I think when I was a bartender and a waitress, what was novel and interesting was meeting new people
Hmm.
and hearing their stories and interacting with them. So this is, in the same way, unpredictable and potentially frustrating, but also potentially fun. So just, I think we're not meant to interact with computer screens. We're meant to interact with something dynamic, a person or an experiment or an artistic project or poetry or
Hmm.
live music or skiing, something that's changing and challenging. And so that's why I'm a psychopharmacologist.
That's very cool. And so I have a proposal for you, maybe for the next time you do an interview and somebody asks you, how would you like to be introduced? Obviously you have a lot of accreditation, you have a lot of things that you've done, but I think pirate scientist should be in there somewhere too. I think it's got to be in there somewhere. And then you're going to have this great conversation about what, the boring subject of psychopharmacologist does.
I guess all scientists are pirates in a way, looking for treasure.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Thank you very much. So
Mhm.
that kind of leads me to the last two questions I have for you, and that is, are you working on anything that you'd love to share with everybody?
Oh my gosh, I am. I have so many ideas. So I'm working on 3 projects. Maybe you can tell me which one you think is the most exciting.
Hmm.
I'm very interested in explaining so I wrote a book, Never Enough, which is probably how you met me, which is about the neuroscience and experience of addiction in general. But I want to write another one, maybe called Primed, about how adolescence is this especially vulnerable period for developing addiction, and how we could together create more meaningful experiences so that kids wouldn't try to find them in a bottle or a pipe or a bowl. Because I think they're kind of sitting ducks right now. It's so easy to get addictive substances and so hard to get yourself to New Zealand in one way or another.
Right.
The Another one is about sex differences in the causes and consequences of addiction. So I study in my research lab how men and, well, males and females, and I mostly work with mice, respond differently to alcohol and drink maybe for different reasons and
Hmm.
have different experiences. So that's another one. And then the third one, which I'm excited about, is kind of why not use drugs? And I would love to help people develop their own informed personal ethic about when and where and how to use drugs or not use drugs to have the best life they could.
Interesting. I am not qualified to make this decision or offer any insight. They all sound super fascinating to me.
That's good.
So super non-committal answer from my end.
I'll get started. I have to do all 3.
But I do think that that last book sounds super interesting because I don't think that's part of the conversation people readily join, because
Yeah.
it's usually kind of a drugs are bad, don't take drugs, versus a is it though? Let's
Yeah.
talk about responsible drug use and how you can help yourself really understand what you're getting yourself into. So
Exactly. And saying it's bad has not worked at all.
right,
And
we have a
it's because it's
long-standing
not
history of
true.
that not working.
Yeah, and it's not true. I think that it's a natural drive. And in some people, it's sometimes with some substances, it can really add to their lives. And in others, it can really detract. So getting the data out there, I think would be a privilege so that people could make better choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, once we say something is taboo, there's a natural tendency for some people to want to really experience that. But when we say it's taboo, we also kind of cut off help, right? Because it's now a shame to say that you've done these things. So I could see a lot of benefit in that, and just an interesting book to read. I'll be honest with you.
All right. Well, if I write it, I'll reach out to you. Or I shouldn't say if, when I write it, I'm going to
When you
start
write
it
it,
over.
perfect,
I'm
great.
I'm doing my last final exam next week to give to students, and then I'll be working on that over my holiday break.
Along with everything else that you got going on.
Right.
And I think the last thing is, do you have a favorite social media platform, or is there a way that people can kind of keep track and see what you're up to and what you're doing? Because I mean, you are doing a lot. So yeah, any way that people can kind of keep track.
Well, I do have a Twitter account, but I haven't used it much. I need to get back on that.
Mhm.
I've just been kind of swamped with everything going on. But they could reach me, maybe prompt me through that, or you could reach me through Bucknell and email. I'm sort of old fashioned, I guess, that way. I don't do Facebook, even if they find me there. I haven't checked into that in hundreds of years. So, but I'm at Bucknell University in central Pennsylvania, and they could find my email there, or judy.grisel@gmail, but that sometimes gets buried. And I'd love to hear from anybody, especially if they have a question about what we've talked about, or a question about neuroscience or addiction or the book. So nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll have links to all the things that we just talked about in the show notes. But like I said, I've been really interested to talk to you. And I cannot thank you enough for kind of the insight and the perspective that you bring to this conversation. I think has been the most enlightening thing, not only from the addiction side and the research side, but also the hospitality experience that you bring into this conversation. I think is really important, and it's kind of refreshing to have a different perspective and into this. So thank you very much for that. And hopefully we'll get a chance to chat with you again in the future.
Okay, about the next book. So thanks, Chris.
Perfect.
Lovely
Thank
to
you
be
very
here.
much.
Bye-bye.
So once again, thank you to Dr. Judy Grisel for joining us on this podcast. Like I said, this is a really hard subject to talk about, but I think it's really, really important. And if we're able to help a couple of people pinpoint some ways to help themselves, I think that's really, really important. So we'll have links to everything that we discussed in the show notes over at abarabove.com. Please, if it's something that you think you need some help with, find somebody to help out. She gave some great advice, whether it be through Alcoholics Anonymous or, a peer network of people that have outside interests, or if it's just a matter of self-discipline. If addiction is something that you're struggling with, it's not something to take lightly. Find some professional help, and have a really happy, healthy life. That's what we're all here for, to enjoy the things that we enjoy, but not at the cost of long-term health and happiness. So once again, I can't thank you guys enough for listening to this. I know this was a harder episode for some people, but I hope, like I mentioned, I hope this does help. So we'll have some more podcasts for you in the future. But until then, stay healthy and happy, and cheers, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.